God damn it. It's just going to get up. Who's starting? Am I starting? Are you starting?
No, you are.
I am.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, can you hear me fine?
Yeah, I'm having a little bit of a breakup, but I don't know if that's either of our internet connections, but I don't know, you seem pretty good for now.
Okay. Well, yeah, you're breaking up a little bit. Let me know if I start and things are not audible. All right. So first off, I'd like to state, this is not my topic. I'm debating this because I was told to debate this. This is something I'm really passionate about. But I think a little specifically, it's saying, this is ethical.
Yeah.
My argument is since I'm going to have to argue that this is ethical, that CRISPR and stuff, that using those are ethical, I'm going to try and say that it's just for future purposes. I'm not saying that we should do those things now, but I think doing the research I've done in the past few hours into it, I've learned a lot about it, and I didn't know about it before I saw what germline modification was. And I'd read a lot about CRISPR, which, for those of you who don't know, essentially CRISPR takes the DNA helix and then it replaces those holes with what you want. And CRISPR is a much more refined version of what they used to have. And CRISPR is good at replacing those sections that it punches out. There was a Chinese team, I think it was in 2005, that was to use non-viable cells that had a blood clotting disorder, I believe it was, and take, I believe it was 89, and out of those 8, less than a dozen were made viable. But it shows the potential of the future of being able to get rid of disease, not just Huntington's disease. Huntington's disease and other disease that are passed through genetics are things that we have an ethical obligation to try and get rid of, whether it be in one manner or another. So I don't believe in the designer babies or designer traits like designing your child for necessarily a certain person. I think if you're an artistic person, you should say to yourself, well, I want my child to be artistic, so I'm going to go for artistic traits or something. Or I want my child to have this color. I think that the reason we should be using germline modification and CRISPR is for ethical reasons, for reasons to get rid of diseases in essentially the way that if we were able to perfect CRISPR and we were able to perfect germline modification in an ethical manner, which I believe is viable embryos and continuing to do essentially what they've been doing. And there's a lot of regulations around this. There's a whole lot of regulations through. So it's not a simple thing. I feel like I've stated my initial arguments. I'd like to hear your arguments against the ethical use of
yeah, I just realized that we're kind of like open mic here, which is weird. That's not what I was expecting, but whatever, I'll roll with it. So I think the main thing is, like, I get that the whole germline modification thing is good for in terms of ethics and looking into the future in terms of like eradicating diseases and doing those sorts of things. But like, let's just be slightly more realistic in the sense that people aren't going to use it just for that. Like, people will become superficial and they will use it to design your own baby. So like, you will have people that are like, yeah, I'm only using it to get rid of diseases, but even that still presents its own problems. But then you'll also have the opposite, where people actually are going to use it to design babies, and there are a whole host of problems there. Things like the fact that it kind of does create a gap in society, and actually any modification, whether it's to get rid of disease or to design a trait or any just genetic modification, will create a gap between the people who have done it and the people who haven't, or even so the people that just can afford it and can't. You also have to look at things like, or issues like the fact that whether or not this is going to damage the gene pool for future generations. Also need to again look at the fact that right now it still is somewhat experimental, so there's no definite whether or not it's going to work. and that creates a whole another kettle of problems. And as good as the purposes or the reasoning behind it may seem, at the moment it's just not ethical to go ahead with until we get it perfect, and that's going to take some time. So to look at it in a contemporary aspect, I don't think it's ethical at all until the practicality of it is actually somewhat decent. But anyway, that's kind of like some form of a summary of what I've got. And
okay, I think we agree on a lot of points, and I think the main thing that this whole debate is supposed to be about is whether or not it's. I believe that this is whether or not it's a morally, objectively ethical or not. And so I wasn't talking about in the current sense, the understanding we have, which is limited, but it's very rapidly progressing. So I do not necessarily say that it is right now to, let's say, get rid of Huntington's, because we don't know what the long-term ramifications will be. We haven't perfected it yet. And so treatment for embryos and unborn babies, and especially since it would cause any errors that were made to pass down to successive generations, you don't want to go off willy-nilly and start doing that. So I agree, but you seem to come to the same conclusion I did, that once we perfect this, that it would moral and ethical obligation to use this technology to benefit society as a whole and get rid of these genetic diseases.
I kind of
so feel like I've just won the debate, because long-term, objectively, it is a ethical thing. I agree that currently it wouldn't be. As to one other point you made, which was the slippery slope. I think you said, a lot of people are going to use this for selfish means. Currently, the National Institute of Health and the National Academy of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine, I guess is the NAS and NAM, they are some of the organizations that they just met recently. Actually, there was a post them where they were having a giant summit, and it was in November of 2015. They announced it. I don't know exactly when it happened, but I believe it's already happened. But the summits to try and talk about these things, because they don't want to jump into this and say, let's start editing kids the way we want them. Let's start make the way that I think a lot of articles are trying to make this a clickbait title, like, hey, do you want your kids to have blue eyes? Here's one way you can do that. I agree that I think that shouldn't be given to parents, because, I mean, if anything that is demonstrated in our society as of late in my mind is that have a kid, and everybody feels like they have the right to have a child, even though you have to take the test for a driver's license. Anybody can have responsibility, and to give the parents the responsibility not only to have the child but also to design it, I think is morally reprehensible. But you know that they have Huntington's in their genetic makeup, and they're trying to prevent that. I believe that that's ethically okay. So I think the slippery slope are if there aren't these fail safes in place that they have, which, like I said, there's a lot of ethical boards. It hasn't even gone past clinical trials and MBA yet, but that doesn't keep people from independently researching this. But there's a lot of laws and a lot of regulations that prevent a lot of research if it's happening. So the slippery slope argument is a reasonable concern, because I think it's going to be hard enough to get lab tested stuff happening, let alone people just for doctor's office.
I think, just to address the first part about what we do and do not agree on, when I say that I think I will concede that it can have good ramifications in the future, that doesn't necessarily mean that I agree with it. I still think in the future there will be ethical concerns which are very much similar to what's happening now. And so even if we were to perfect it, a lot of the problems that will still come. And so that having a perfect genetic modification isn't going to mitigate any of the harms. And so, which will bring me to probably one of the biggest main arm of my case here, is that it's going to create a massive gap between people, between society, because it's not going to be something that can be easily afforded by very many people. So you're going to have, on one hand, you're going to have the actual parents of these children who are like, oh, my kid's so much better than yours because, like either they've designed their own child, or even if they haven't, they just have limited diseases that can actually affect them. And so you're going to have parents that are like, oh, well, my kid's so much better than yours because they can't get sick or they can't get this. And then you're going to have people who generally look at that and think, oh, well, this isn't great. The people that can't afford that. And so it's going to create a bit of a disparity gap between the two of them, when you've got, on one hand, people who are like, yeah, my kid's so perfect because I can afford to get rid of diseases. And then you're going to have everybody else that's like, well, why can't I do that? If the government should be able to do that for me, because it's not fair, because that's also an ethical concern. If, some children are able to be disease-free, then, we should be able to make that available for everybody, which just probably isn't going to happen. So there's the first problem with having the gap in society. But also the second is that if this were to happen, obviously you're going to have people with better qualities, and that's not necessarily physical. Like, that can be pretty much anything, right? And so that makes it hard for people who haven't been genetically modified to actually get a job, because obviously it's within a business's best interest to employ people who are of a higher standard, which then means that, they're obviously going to be more likely to employ people who have been genetically modified, which means that, the people that can't afford to, or have come from like lower backgrounds, are then locked out from getting certain jobs, because everyone's like, oh, well, we only want people who are genetically modified. And even if they do it implicitly, that problem still happens. And so it just creates this gap between, basically, like I said, people who can afford it and people who can't afford it. And then that has its own kettle of problems, which is going to stem from something like this. And which is, even if we were to perfect it, something that it just shouldn't happen and is unethical. But anyway, back to you.
I think those are some somewhat valid points. I think the first one, the my kid is kind of better than yours, is the note I wrote for myself. It's a very poor reason to not use germline modification, because you could use that same argument, the polio vaccine. There were families that, were in circumstances, they didn't necessarily have to be financial, but they were in circuit from somebody who had the vaccine. And so I really do not see it being was used, and they found, we can for sure do this, and there's no, serious risks that the risks don't outweigh the benefits. It would be some health insurance. But, that kind of thing is really up in the air, and that's talking about insurance company. But I do not say, well, kids are going to be, first off, parents aren't going to discuss this if they do it. They're going to want to keep it private, because even just the idea of it upsets certain people. Some people get very upset about it, and I think because of reasons like you stated, like they're worried that they're different. You said something about employers wanting to hire people who are better suited, or who are more intelligent, or who are argued for using it to prevent preventable diseases or genetic diseases. So my arguments would be by HIPAA. Person had this procedure done before they were born. At least in theory, it would be covered by HIPAA, which basically says that, your doctor can't share any information about you and your employer, and no one else can find out about your medical background without your permission. So okay. It would be a violation of HIPAA for companies to do this.
Okay, I'm just going to jump in there, right? So it's not like employers are going to go to the person's doctor and be like, look, or it's not going to be on the person's medical record. It's the fact that people will eventually start to find out. Like, obviously right now, if it were to happen, probably not. But if we were to take, your analysis earlier and assume that this is like way in the future where it's like perfected and it happens and it's fine, people are going to be more comfortable talking about it because it's such a normal procedure in the future, which means that it's going to get out that, these types of people are the ones, who are, for lack of a better phrase, better than everybody else. And so people are going to start to realize.
But they're not better just because they don't have Huntington's.
No, but
I'd understand, these changes that they were going to make them taller and smarter and faster. But we're talking about just keeping them from having a debilitating disease.
But that's also assuming that people aren't going to do it for this. They're not going to change anything, which is just, I don't think is valid, because I don't think, I seriously think that society at the moment is just so superficial that it might start off the way that you want it to and the way that you have premised it to, but it's not going to end like that, and it's not going to stay like that. And so, eventually some people will.
But the slippery slope isn't a reason to do something. You can make the slippery slope argument for almost anything, from abortion to suicide. And you can say, well, if you start giving women the right to abort, use it as plan B instead of even using birth control, because who needs birth control if you could just take have an abortion if you get pregnant? I mean, you can use the slippery slope argument for anything without using a slippery slope and just saying that there are so many different ethical boards you currently have to go through just to do testing on this, let alone your human trial. We are so far from the point where it's going to become available, and once it becomes available, it's going to be probably more, like you said, it's probably going to be more expensive. So it'd be something like chemotherapy would be for a cancer patient. It'll be something that'll be expensive, and there'll be maybe side effects that we don't know about, but that shouldn't prevent us from utilizing these things to try in a way that we used vaccines to eliminate diseases in the past. And I don't think people will be so petty immediately that our society is very superficial. And I think that a lot of people, mainly uneducated people who don't have the money to do this, will think of it and read an article on and go, that sounds interesting. I've always wanted a kid with blue eyes and brown hair or something. Instead of that, the people who are going to be wanting to do, I'm just reading this article right now, Sarah Gray of the American Association of Tissue Banks was one of the people who spoke up at a meeting where her son died apparently of a genetic disease after he was born, after suffering terrible seizures. As Sharon Begley reported in Stat, Gray told the attendees, if you have the skills and knowledge to frickin' do it. So I think the parents who have children that have these diseases and they have to watch them be born and then die, anything to be able to change that, and to think that people are going to use it for their own selfish means is a legitimate thought and a legitimate concern, but it shouldn't allow us, or shouldn't prevent us from moving forward into the future as far as having a better society with.
Yeah, no, I totally no, I don't think it should either, but I just don't think that it's going to turn out like that. I can't see any reason as to why it won't end up like that. But anyway, so moving on from that, because it's probably not going to go much further than there. It's also really dangerous to start modifying genes or to start removing genes, particularly because a lot of the time they don't all work singularly. And so by taking one gene out, it kind of removes the ability for genes to work together to come to any kind of real purpose, right? So, and I'm trying to think of an example, but I'm having a bit of trouble here. I'm just reading what I've written on one of the whiteboards in this room. That, like there are some potentially major personality issues that will come from removing genes, right? So you might have one gene that, is that helps, well, not so much helps, but contributes towards getting certain diseases, but also works in the same manner to like prevent anger management and all those kinds of things. And like, there's probably a much better way for me to articulate this. But like, my mind's running 1,000 miles. So if you don't understand, just tell me, and I'll try and rephrase. But yeah, and so if you were to take away that one gene, then all of a sudden the rest of the genes that work to get that one trait, all of a sudden they don't work. And so you might have someone who doesn't have a certain disease, but then they also suffer from different personality issues, just because of the fact that there's no real way for us to take out a gene and then replace it with something that's been modified. to do it the same purpose, just because I don't know if we'll ever have that technology. And so that then creates its own ethical problems, because do we want a bunch of people who have some major personality problems, or do we want a bunch of people who don't have personality problems and are still susceptible to diseases, whilst we are developing, ways to get around those diseases? Because there are, genetic modification isn't the only way to eradicate diseases. It might sound like the best option, but it's not the only one. And so then that asks the question, like, where do we kind of draw the line?
Well, I guess I agree with you in a lot of respect. That I think that currently, with our current understanding of it, it's not necessarily ethical to use it right now. We don't know the long-term ramifications, and as you said, there could be personality, but the difference is you're assuming the worst. I mean, you're assuming that as this happened, that they're going to have some horrible thing happen, which is totally possible. But we're arguing a life-ending, painful, debilitating condition, or having a personality disorder. And as somebody who's worked with people for years, I mean, it's if I had to choose between one or the other, like having Huntington's disease or BP disorder or anger management problems, I would obviously want the anger management issues that I could cope with, and you can't cope with ALS. So I do, like I said, understand and respect those arguments. But once we perfect this, because CRISPR is the newer version of, I'm trying to find the original name for the one that they worked on before. But before CRISPR, it was TALENs, ZFN and TALENs, TALENs, was apparently used earlier, and then CRISPR took over. And so we're making these huge jumps, apparently, because I'm not a scientist, but gigantic leaps we're making. And it's part of the reason that we've had so much trouble getting to this point. Like we know that stem cells are a genuinely good treatment for a lot of things. They've been shown to help repair all kinds of problems that people have had, and yet that is something that is very, very difficult for people to study and actually do research on because of the moral ramifications and things like that. So you run into the same issues with this, that people are going to say, look, that people are going to use this for themselves, that there might be possibilities of harming people down the road. And you face all of those things with any medication that you, because they can not only cause issues with you, they can cause issues with reproduction. Zika is not a medication, something that's been spread by mosquitoes. That's been causing issues for people with birth and reproduction. So let's say something new that we know is causing something that kids are being born with who have this. Now, if we find out that it's genetically passed down, let's say it becomes HIV has, because HIV is also something that apparently through, I was reading that there's reasons that we should, because of HIV, it says apparently modify the genes to lower the risk of contracting or developing HIV or AIDS. But apparently the same things that make people resistant makes them more likely to die of West Nile virus, as reported by somebody in the Atlantic. I'm just reading this as I go. Mm-hmm. But the dying from West Nile is far lower than their risk of dying from HIV, especially if they live in the West. Nile virus, unless you visit those areas that it's abundant, the chances of you getting it are, pretty freaking slim. So weighing out the pros and cons of, with this modification that would make HIV, less likely to affect a person, but more susceptible to this specific thing, is that a change we should make? And that's where you really get into the ethical meat. And I think when it comes to those kinds of decisions, it's ethical to prevent the most amount of suffering for the amount of people. So if we can, for one generation, prevent someone from contracting or passing to progressive generations, then we're making a huge impact. Now, could that person have issues of their own or be more susceptible to other things? And hopefully we'll do enough research to find out that it will be very minimal. But I think it is our ethical obligation to at least explore these instead of pushing them to the back like we have with other technologies that we were scared of because they deal with our humanity and they deal with accountability. So, I mean, we've been doing this with plants and animals for years. We've been modifying plants and animals, whether through slating, which is eugenics, essentially what we, say the Nazis did, was trying to create a perfect race. We do that with dogs. That's why there's purebred dogs. And those dogs have then the dogs that are mutts. And so, I mean, we've been doing this for a long time. The fact that we're doing it with our own species is comfortable for us. But if we look back and realize that doing this for our species in the same way that we've bred out traits that were undesirable, and now we have the dogs, we have 30,000, I think it's 33,000 years, the oldest I know of. It could to the point where CRISPR is something that we're going to use on a regular basis. But the fact that it's a possibility means that we have an ethical obligation to explore.
Okay, I'm gonna hardline the fuck out of this, and this, just for you and anyone watching, this doesn't necessarily reflect everything that I believe in. I'm just taking the hardline. So let's just take CRISPR or any genetic modification at its best and assume that it works. It completely eradicates not only one disease, but like all diseases or any disease for that matter. So what happens next, right? So we now have a whole set number of people who no longer are susceptible to any illness. They're no longer susceptible to pretty much almost death, right? And so that creates a whole kettle of new problems, right? So again, to take the hard line, assuming that we take away anything that, removes our ability for natural selection to come into play, and like I hate to use it, but hey, it's a thing. Right, so what happens? We now have a population of people who are going to live for so long. It means that, all of the problems that we now face, with current overpopulation are just going to be absolutely, they're just going to become so much bigger than they actually are. And we're already struggling enough as it is now, right?
So you're saying population sizes would boom?
Things like that, yeah. And the reason why that's going to happen is because, without diseases that are pretty much, like life-ending, then people are going to live for so much longer, which, in the short term, it sounds great. Yeah, we no longer have diseases, right? We can no longer, we no longer end suffering in these respects. But then you have to also look at the long-term effects of what's going to happen in terms of overpopulation, which is something that we already have problems with now, which is, it's a bit of an ethical issue, like what do we do?
I'd love to debate the topic of overpopulation because it's not something we're actually facing. We're facing overcrowding in like India, but the reason that people think that we're going to face overpopulation is because of how many kids people had. But I was reading an article about this not too long ago, and they were talking about how the reason that women had more kids back in the day, like women used to have like 4, and now they have 2, because they had more kids in case one of them passed away from a disease, in case one of them died. It was kind of a backup. The more kids you have, if it's the same way that sea turtles and other animals, will produce in a large pack, then they'll crawl out and go where they're trying to go and survive, and some of them will get eaten, killed, but they produce enough that their lineage keeps going. If we get to the point where disease, the genetic disease, and HIV is less receptive to people or something, my brain's fried too, we would get to the point where people would have less kids. because there would be less need to feel like you're filling this gap. So I totally think that it would increase our lifespan. It would make people happier. It would make there less suffering, less visits to the doctor. It sounds like an overall better world. And the only reasons that we're not doing it right now are the fact that, better. But once we understand it better, which we're close to getting to, we're not too far away from understanding it more and more. We've made huge leaps and bounds. And once we did enough, then we'll get to the point where we can say, we have an ethical obligation to doing this. The same way that we vaccinate children for measles, smallpox, polio, and things like that. There are people that could argue, do argue that we still shouldn't vaccinate children because of the risks. And it doesn't matter what the scientific community says to these, because their arguments are always, well, I think that, it won't affect my kid, or my kid will be affected worse by it, personal argument. But when the scientists themselves say, we don't think that this is something you need to worry about, then people don't care. People believe what they want to believe. And so that's why I've tried to stay focused on genetic diseases and not designer baby.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I back that. The only thing the main response I had to that is, and going back to the whole children thing, right? So I don't think a lot of people have kids and have multiple kids to further their family line anymore. Like, I feel like some people might, but I feel like for the most part, people generally just have kids because they want to. Or sometimes they don't want to, but it happens anyway. And so I think, as much as I, to some extent agree that, some people might have less kids, I don't think that it's going to not end in somewhat of a population boom. And this, might happen 50 years into the future. It might happen 100 years. Whenever it does happen, once we start to get rid of diseases, then a lot of people, people are just going to start living longer. And in terms of overpopulation, it might not be a massive problem now, but I can tell you that in Australia, right now, our elderly population is far outweighing our younger population. We just don't have the people, when people just aren't replacing the older generations. And so that, creates a whole nother set of problems. Once people basically stop dying at young ages, then, the population starts to live longer. People start, and then that's part of what causes population booms, which aren't necessarily a good thing. And I don't want to go too far into it, because off the top of my head, it's not a topic I know much about. But I definitely think that, to go on the hard line, in the short term, and to end suffering, to end diseases, that all sounds all fine and dandy. But then you also need to look into the future and the adverse effects of, having a population which pretty much, doesn't really die early. Because, and then coming back to the slippery slope, and I'm not using this as a main argument, but just as a side anecdote kind of thing. The slippery slope is that once we kind of get rid of diseases, what's the next step? Do we just stop people from dying? And so, like I said, that's not a major point. So don't try too hard to engage with that. But it's kind of just looking into the future. I don't think it's an ethical thing for us to feel like we have a responsibility to do something for the short term with the potential risk for major long-term issues, especially that come with that. But also the fact that, and I'm starting to read this now, that with modifying genes and modifying genetics, you also create the chance for mutations. So it might be that, we might be able to get rid of Huntington's, we might be able to get rid of HIV, we might be able to get rid of this and that. But the fact is, we're still modifying genetics. And so the ethical concern here is that if we modify them to the point where, we get rid of diseases, what then do we open the door to do? Because genetics works in a way that, we don't understand. Well, we do, but not to the, not
I think
to
that we should be, continuing to modify plants and animals in the way that we have been for quite a time now. Nothing ethically wrong with that.
I think
where do you draw
again,
the line?
I'm going to take the hard line again here, is that as humans, we have more of an obligation to protect the well-being of ourselves than we do animals and plants. And, okay, outside of debate world, I don't think that we should be modifying anything, whether it's a human, a plant, or an animal. But, for the purposes of the debate here, I think we should draw the line at plants and animals and just leave humans alone. Just by virtue of the fact that, we also then move into the ethical concerns of consent, right? In the same way that and I have my case written on glass walls around the room. So if I look away, it's because I'm reading something on the wall. So in the same way that you wouldn't actively choose to do something that could potentially, well, you shouldn't actively choose to do something that could potentially
away from the overpopulation. Can I address the overpopulation? Because we're not growing exponentially. I'm reading this from the Population Research Institute. Between 1950 and, in fact, our rates of growth are declining. Between 1950 and 2000, the world population grew at a rate of 1.76%. Between 2000 and 2050, it is expected 0.77%. So yes, because 0.77 is greater than 0, it is a positive growth rate, and the world population will continue to grow. Most of the countries, so apparently the population of Nigeria by 2050 is expected to have a larger population size than the United States. About 48% of all people live in a country with below replacement fertility. So that means that people are not reproducing as much. And about 58% so about 48%, about 50% of people are living like that. And the global fertility rate is 2.53 children per woman. And, I would say definitely in the West that, like, for instance, my brother and his wife are having a kid soon. And they're not having that child because they want a child. But when you're talking about a tribe in Africa or from Australia, so maybe the Aborigine Australians, they, especially the people who don't find Western medicine useful and prefer to treat themselves, they're going to have more children because they're going to be facing more problems. And so they're still living in this, primitive sense, need to keep their tribe alive. And the way they do that is by keeping their women producing children. That's something that's going to happen. But again, we're not facing an overpopulation. That's not a threat to us. And I think you agreed with me, and you've realized that you've agreed. But I think in the long term, it is an objective duty of ours to use technology like this if we can take suffering of other people. And if we can prevent genetic diseases like Huntington's, then it is our ethical obligation to do so. As it stands, as we have this conversation, that we can't do that without knowing what the long-term ramifications are. In 5 won't know exactly what they are. I don't know if you know I forget what it's called. It's how our processors grow 2 times every year or something in speed. It's essentially the way that science works. Like our understanding of science and the world around us grows exponentially. We get more instruments, we get more methods of testing, we do more testing, we do more peer review on the testing we've already done. And so we're going to get a matter of if, it's a matter of when, that we're able to do this and say with a clean conscience that it's okay. So I'd like to hear why you really believe that humans, though, are different than animals, because I think that if we're going to say that we have an ethic not to do this to humans, then we know animals are sentient creatures. We shouldn't be doing it to them either. If we're going to line, as you said, then we get into consent. I mean, animals can show consent. If you go up to a dog, it can either let you pet it or it can bite you. It can be interacting with it, or it can obviously not consent. So I think that, you're trying to draw this line in the sand possible with this subject.
I back that. Again, I'm hardlining here, so this is not necessarily how I actually think, because it's actually the complete opposite. in terms of okay, so to address the whole like indigenous tribes in Australia, in African countries, or in anywhere really, like that's all well and good, but that's you also conceded that they don't trust Western medicine, right? So these are the people who are not likely to use this type of technology. The people that are more likely to use this technology are people who are in more developed countries, people who actually, are able to utilize Western medicine, which means that while we might not be experiencing a population boom right now, which is probably something I should have rephrased better earlier, the potential is that once people start to think that that their kids aren't going to die at a young age because of a high infant mortality rate, or because once they realize that them or their kids aren't going to die at a young age because of anything, then they will be more likely to have kids because they know that their kids are going to be successful. They have this idea that their kids are going to be successful, right? So population will slowly start to increase, and this is obviously something that very very contingent on whether or not this actually works. But anyway, and so that's kind of how it kind of looks like it's going to end. But moving from there, again, hardlining in terms of animals, like I get that they can show consent and stuff, and like ethically we should be able to have the same ethical constraints to animals and plants than we do to humans. But at the same time, we are so much further arguably more developed than animals, right? And so I think we have an ethical obligation to protect our own interests before we protect the interests of animals. And so if it means that, we're testing something like this, something so dangerous on an animal rather than another person, in debate world, I totally stand for that. In the real world, maybe not so much, but debate world, I totally do. Because, at the moment it's so experimental, but also, going that extra step further on consent, like I was trying to say earlier, in the same way that we wouldn't, actively harm someone without their consent,
we should give diabetics insulin?
Sorry, I just kind of breaking up, so I'm only getting bits and pieces of what you're saying. So I'm responding the best I can.
Diabetics insulin?
Yeah, so what about it? Like, I only got the second part of that.
Do you think that we should give diabetics insulin? And do you understand that giving them insulin has contributed to altering the genetic diversity of the population? By allowing them to live, modify the genetic population to keep allowing people potentially to pass on those that have died off from natural causes would continue to live on longer. So do you think that if we're going to say that, you draw the line, at what point do you say we can't do that?
Well, I think in debate world, if I'm obviously going to say any genetic modification is bad, then I also would stand for that very same phrase, that any genetic modification is bad. And so whether or not that includes, getting rid of HIV/AIDS, whether that includes getting rid of diabetes or any other genetic disease, I in terms of debate world, yes, I totally stand for that, because it means that, we are altering the DNA and potentially opening the doors to some pretty harmful effects in the future. So while, yeah, like I've been saying, short term sounds great, in the long term, it's not really something that we have an ethical obligation to provide, considering, all of the adverse effects that could potentially come from.
But objectively, you can agree that this is something that if we can get it down to the point where it says, from the research I've been doing, being editing less. So if we can perfect the art of manipulating less than 1% of something, which is difficult to do with anything and change detail and anything, then can we at least agree that it is our objective duty to take care of removing way that we vaccinated against polio? Or do you think that, like the polio vaccine, it should be viewed with skepticism instead of open arms and warm embraces?
See, this is just so hard because I completely disagree with the topic that I'm arguing, but and all of the points I'm saying. So from debating perspective, I would agree with what you just said, that, you know, we should be looking at it somewhat skeptical because of the fact that, you know, it can cause problems. Real world, not so much. Yes.